The history of East Asia covers the people inhabiting of the eastern subregion of the Asian continent known as East Asia from prehistoric times to the present. Prehistory. Homo erectus is believed to have lived in East and Southeast Asia from 1.8 million to 40,000 years ago. Their regional distinction is classified as Homo erectus sensu stricto. Fossils representing 40 Homo erectus individuals, known as Peking man, were found near Beijing at Zhoukoudian that date to about 400,000 years ago. The species was believed to have lived for at least several 100,000 years in China, and possibly until 200,000 years ago in Indonesia. They may have been the first to use fire and cook food. Homo sapiens migrated into inland Asia, likely by following herds of bison and mammoth, and arrived in southern Siberia by about 43,000 years ago, and some people moved south or east from there. The earliest sites of Neolithic culture include Nanzhuangtu culture around 9500 BC to 9000 BC, Pengtushan culture around 7500 BC to 6100 BC, Pelagang culture around 7000 BC to 5000 BC. The Juman pottery period is sometimes labeled the Korean Neolithic, but since intensive agriculture and evidence of European-style Neolithic lifestyle is sparse at best, such terminology is misleading. The Juman was a period of hunting, gathering, and small-scale cultivation of plants. Archaeologists sometimes refer to this lifestyle pattern as broad-spectrum hunting and gathering. The Domon period occurred in Japan from circa 14,000 BC to 300 BC, with some characteristics of both Neolithic and Mesolithic culture. Ancient civilizations in East Asia. Ancient Chinese dynasties. The Xia dynasty of China is the first dynasty to be described in ancient historical records such as Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian and Bamboo Annals. Following this was the Shang dynasty, which ruled in the Yellow River Valley. The classic account of the Shang comes from texts such as the Classic of History, Bamboo Annals, and records of the Grand Historian. According to the traditional chronology, the Shang ruled from 1766 BC to 1122 BC. But according to the chronology based upon the current texts of Bamboo Annals, they ruled from 1556 BC to 1046 BC. The Zhou dynasty lasted only until 771 BC, a period known as the Western Zhou. This period of Chinese history produced what many consider the zenith of Chinese bronzeware making. The dynasty also spans the period in which the written script evolved into its modern form with the use of an archaic clerical script that emerged during the late Warring States period. Confucianism. Confucianism is an ethical and philosophical system developed during the Spring and Autumn period. It later developed metaphysical and cosmological elements in the Han Dynasty. Following the official abandonment of legalism in China after the Qin dynasty, Confucianism became the official state ideology of the Han. Nonetheless, from the Han period onwards, most Chinese emperors have used a mix of legalism and Confucianism as their ruling doctrine. The disintegration of the Han in the 2nd century CE opened the way for the soteriological doctrines of Buddhism and Taoism to dominate intellectual life at that time. A Confucian revival began during the Tang dynasty. In the late Tang, Confucianism developed aspects on the model of Buddhism and Taoism and was reformulated as Neo-Confucianism. This reinvigorated form was adopted as the basis of the imperial exams and the core philosophy of the scholar official class in the Song dynasty. The abolition of the examination system in 1905 marked the end of official Confucianism. The new culture intellectuals of the early 20th century blamed Confucianism for China's weaknesses. They searched for new doctrines to replace Confucian teachings. Some of these new ideologies include the three principles of the people, with the establishment of the Republic of China, and then Maoism under the People's Republic of China. Historically, cultures and countries strongly influenced by Confucianism include mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, as well as various territories settled predominantly by Chinese people, such as Singapore. In the 20th century, Confucianism's influence has been greatly reduced. More recently, there have been talks of a Confucian revival in the academia and the scholarly community. Buddhism has also been a major influence on East Asian culture. It was introduced to China during the Han Dynasty. Taoism, the first organized form of Taoism, the Tianxi school, developed from the Five Pecks of Rice movement at the end of the 2nd century CE. The latter had been founded by Zhang Daoling, who claimed that Laozi appeared to him in the year 142. The Tianxi school was officially recognized by ruler Cao Cao in 215, legitimizing Cao Cao's rise to power in return. Laozi received imperial recognition as of divinity in the mid-2nd century BCE. Taoism, in form of the Shangqing school, gained official status in China again during the Tang dynasty, whose emperors claimed Laozi as their relative. The Shangqing movement, however, had developed much earlier, in the 4th century, on the basis of a series of revelations by gods and spirits to a certain Yangshi in the years between 364 to 370, Qin and Han dynasties. In 221 BC, the state of Qin succeeded in conquering the other 6 states, creating the first imperial dynasty of China for the first time. Following the death of the emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, the Qin dynasty collapsed and control was taken over by the Han dynasty in 206 BC. In AD 220, the Han Empire collapsed into the Three Kingdoms. The series of trade routes known as Silk Road began during the Han Dynasty. Divisions and reunification of China. Three Kingdoms period. The Three Kingdoms period consisted of the Kingdom of Wei, Shu, and Wu. It began when the ruler of Wei, Cao Cao, was defeated by Liu Bei and Sun Quan at the Battle of Red Cliffs. After Cao Cao's death in AD 220, his son Cao Pi became emperor of Wei. Liu Bei and Sun Quan declared themselves emperor of Shu and Wu respectively. Many famous personages in Chinese history were born during this period, including Hua Tuo and the great military strategist Zhuge Liang. Buddhism, which was introduced during the Han Dynasty, also became popular in this period. 2 years after Wei conquered Shu in AD 263, Sima Yan, vice imperial chancellor, overthrew Wei and started the Western Jin dynasty. The conquest of Wu by the Western Jin dynasty ended the Three Kingdoms period, and China was unified again. However, the Western Jin did not last long. Following the death of Sima Yan, the War of the Eight Princes began. This war weakened the Jin dynasty, and it soon fell to the kingdom of Hanzhou. This ushered in the 16 kingdoms. Southern and Northern dynasties. The Northern Wei was established by the Tuoba clan of the Zhabei people in AD 386, when they united the northern part of China. During the Northern Wei, Buddhism flourished, and became an important tool for the emperors of the Northern Wei, since they were believed to be living incarnations of Buddha. Soon, the Northern Wei was divided into the Eastern Wei and Western Wei. These were followed by the Northern Zhou and Northern Qi. In the south, the dynasties were much less stable than the northern dynasties. The four dynasties were weakened by conflicts between the ruling families. Buddhism, also one of the major religions in East Asia, was introduced into China during the Han Dynasty from Nepal in the 1st century BC. Buddhism was originally introduced to Korea from China in 372, and eventually arrived in Japan around the turn of the 6th century. For a long time Buddhism remained a foreign religion with a few believers in China, mainly taught by immigrant Indian teachers. During the Tang dynasty, a fair amount of translations from Sanskrit into Chinese were done by Chinese priests. and Buddhism became one of the major religions of the Chinese along with the other two indigenous religions. In Korea, Buddhism was not seen to conflict with the rites of nature worship. It was allowed to blend in with shamanism. Thus, the mountains that were believed to be the residence of spirits in pre-Buddhist times became the sites of Buddhist temples. Though Buddhism initially enjoyed wide acceptance, even being supported as the state ideology during the Goguryeo, Silafaka, Bala, and Goryeo periods, Buddhism in Korea suffered extreme repression during the Joseon dynasty. In Japan, Buddhism and Shinto were combined by a theological theory, Ryobu Shinto, which says Shinto deities are avatars of various Buddhist entities, including Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. This became the mainstream notion of Japanese religion. In fact, until the Meiji government declared their separation in the mid-19th century, many Japanese people believed that Buddhism and Shinto were one religion. In Mongolia, Buddhism flourished two times, first in the Mongol Empire, and finally in the Manchu Qing dynasty from Tibet in the last 2,000 years. It was mixed in with Tengriism and shamanism. Sui dynasty in AD 581, Yang Jian overthrew the northern Zhou, and established the Sui dynasty. Later, Yang Jian, who became Sui Wendi, conquered the Chen dynasty, and united China. However, this dynasty was short-lived. Sui Wendi's successor, Sui Yangdi, expanded the Grand Canal, and launched four disastrous wars against the Goguryeo. These projects depleted the resources and the workforce of the Sui. In AD 618, Sui Yangdi was murdered. Li Yuan, the former governor of Taiyuan, declared himself the emperor, and founded the Tang dynasty. Civil service, a government system supported by a large class of Confucian literati selected through civil service examinations, was perfected under Tang rule. This competitive procedure was designed to draw the best talents into government, but perhaps an even greater consideration for the Tang rulers, aware that imperial dependence on powerful aristocratic families and warlords would have destabilizing consequences, was to create a body of career officials having no autonomous territorial or functional power base. As it turned out, these scholar officials acquired status in their local communities, family ties, and shared values that connected them to the imperial court. From Tang times until the closing days of the Qing dynasty in 1911, scholar officials functioned often as intermediaries between the grassroots level and the government. This model of government had an influence on Korea and Japan. Printing press, the first known movable type system, was invented in China around 1040 AD by Pai Sheng. Pai Sheng's type was made of baked clay, as described by the Chinese scholar Shen Kuo. The world's first metal-based movable type printing press was invented in Korea in 1234, 210 years before Johannes Gutenberg invented a similar press in Germany. Jikji is the world's oldest extant movable metal print book. It was published in Hengdeok Temple in 1377, 78 years prior to Gutenberg's 42-line Bible, printed during the years 1452 to 1455. Invasions from Central Asia. The Goryeo-Khitan Wars of the 10th and 11th century. The Mongol invasions of Korea between 1231 to 1259. The Mongol invasions of Japan of 1274 and 1281. The Mongol invasions of Vietnam in 1257, 1285 and 1287 AD. Gunpowder. Most sources credit the discovery of gunpowder to Chinese alchemists in the 9th century searching for an elixir of immortality. The discovery of gunpowder was probably the product of centuries of alchemical experimentation. Saltpeter was known to the Chinese by the mid-1st century AD, and there is strong evidence of the use of saltpeter and sulfur in various largely medicine combinations. A Chinese alchemical text from 492 noted that saltpeter gave off a purple flame when ignited, providing for the first time a practical and reliable means of distinguishing it from other inorganic salts. making it possible to evaluate and compare purification techniques. By most accounts, the earliest Arabic and Latin descriptions of the purification of saltpeter do not appear until the 13th century. The first reference to gunpowder is probably a passage in the Zhenyuan Midao Yaolu, a Taoism text tentatively dated to the mid-9th century. Some have heated together sulfur, realgar and saltpeter with honey, smoke and flames result, so that their hands and faces have been burnt, and even the whole house where they were working burned down. The earliest surviving recipes for gunpowder can be found in the Chinese military treatise Wu Jingzong Yao of 1044 AD, which contains 2 for use in incendiary bombs to be thrown by siege engines and 1 intended as fuel for poison smoke bombs. The formulas in the Wu Jingzong Yao range from 27 to 50% nitrate. Experimenting with different levels of saltpeter content eventually produced bombs, grenades, and landmines, in addition to giving fire arrows a new lease on life. By the end of the 12th century, there were cast iron grenades filled with gunpowder formulations capable of bursting through their metal containers. The 14th century Huo Longjing contains gunpowder recipes with nitrate levels ranging from 12 to 91%, 6 of which approach the theoretical composition for maximal explosive force. In China, the 13th century saw the beginnings of rocketry and the manufacture of the oldest gun still in existence. A descendant of the earlier fire lance, a gunpowder-fueled flamethrower that could shoot shrapnel along with fire. The Huo Longjing text of the 14th century also describes hollow, gunpowder-packed exploding cannonballs. In the 13th century, contemporary documentation shows gunpowder beginning to spread from China by the Mongols to the rest of the world. Starting with Europe and the Islamic world, the Arabs acquired knowledge of saltpeter, which they called Chinese snow, around 1240 and, soon afterward, of gunpowder. They also learned of fireworks and rockets. Persians called saltpeter Chinese salt, or salt from Chinese salt marshes. Historian Ahmad Y. al-Hassan argues, contra the general notion, that the Chinese technology passed through Arabic alchemy and chemistry before the 13th century. Gunpowder arrived in India by the mid-14th century, but could have been introduced by the Mongols perhaps as early as the mid-13th century. Three Kingdoms of Korea. B.C. 58, the Korean peninsula was divided into 3 kingdoms, Baekje, Silla and Goguryeo. Although they shared a similar language and culture, these 3 kingdoms constantly fought with each other for control of the peninsula. Furthermore, Goguryeo had been engaged in constant wars with the Chinese. This included the Goguryeo-Sui Wars, where the kingdom of Goguryeo managed to repel the invading forces of the Sui dynasty. As the kingdom of Silla conquered nearby city-states, they gained access to the Yellow Sea, making direct contact with the Tang dynasty possible. The Tang dynasty teamed up with Silla and formed a strategy to invade Goguryeo. Since Goguryeo had been able to repel earlier Chinese invasions from the north, perhaps Goguryeo would fall if it were attacked by Silla from the south at the same time. However, in order to do this, the Tang-Silla alliance had to eliminate Goguryeu's nominal ally Baekje and secure a base of operations in southern Korea for a second front. In 660, the coalition troops of Silla and Tang of China attacked Baekje, resulting in the annexation of Baekje by Silla. Together, Silla and Tang effectively eliminated Baekje when they captured the capital of Sabi, as well as Baekje's last king, Uija, and most of the royal family. However, Yamato Japan and Baekje had been long-standing and very close allies. In 663, Baekje revival forces and a Japanese naval fleet convened in southern Baekje to confront the Silla forces in the Battle of Bakgang. The Tang dynasty also sent 7,000 soldiers and 170 ships. After 5 naval confrontations that took place in August 663 at Batgang, considered the lower reaches of Tongjin River, the Silla Tang forces emerged victorious. The Silla Tang forces turned their attention to Goguryeo. Although Goguryeo had repelled the Sui dynasty a century earlier, attacks by the Tang dynasty from the west proved too formidable. The Silla-Tang alliance emerged victorious in the Goguryeo-Tang Wars. Silla thus unified most of the Korean peninsula in 668, but the kingdom's reliance on China's Tang dynasty had its price. Silla had to forcibly resist the imposition of Chinese rule over the entire peninsula. Silla then fought for nearly a decade to expel Chinese forces to finally establish a unified kingdom as far north as modern Pyongyang. Silla's unification of Korea was short-lived. The northern region of the defunct Goguryeo state later re-emerged as Bala, due to the leadership of former Goguryeo general Daedoyong. 16th century to 1945. The expansion of the Ryukyu Kingdom. The Nunbun trade in Japan. The unification of Japan and the Japanese invasions of Korea. The Japanese invasion of Ryukyu. The 10 Great Campaigns in China. The growth of European imperialism in Asia, starting with the rise of global trade routes. The whole wars between the years 1865 and 1890. The First and Second Opium Wars in the mid-19th century. The Sino-French War from September 1884 to June 1885. The First Sino-Japanese War occurred between 1894 and 1895, primarily over control of the country Korea. The Russo-Japanese War from February 10, 1904 September 5, 1905. The Second Sino-Japanese War occurred between 1931 and 1945, from 1941 on as part of World War II.